That works. All right. So we're going to get into it. Exodus chapter 2. Last week we actually went on what I thought was a very necessary side trail that still plays into the whole of what we're talking about here. Because now we're going to get into Israel's deliverance after a tremendous amount of time of slavery. And I will say, I understand why they ended up having to be in the space that they were in. We touched on this last week when we said, well, the reality is, had they remained where they were, they would have been victims of the famine. And the lineage couldn't have continued. And we need that Abrahamic lineage to continue because that's where the promised Messiah is coming from. And we can't have that destroyed. But I guarantee you that if Satan had half a pound of rocks in his head, then of course it would be his greatest plot and ploy to destroy that lineage. And so I'm sure on some sort of level we'll find out on the other side when we look back at this and ask God, tell us about that entire period of time. He's probably going to say it was within the plan of Satan in order to destroy the promised seed through that famine. But it was my will that they wouldn't perish so that Messiah could come. And in order to preserve that, this is why I gave Joseph the visions that I gave him and the plan in order to preserve the people. But of course, that means they're being preserved in a foreign land, not the promised land of Abraham and his seed. And in being in that land, they fell under oppression and slavery. And so I pose this question for everyone in the room to consider, and give me your thoughts on it. If there is goodness in God, and if God is aware of everything that happens to us, why slavery? Why did the Israelites have to go through that? What did that serve in any way? What was its purpose? What do you think? Oh, hello. I'm going to actually pause right now. That was a little commercial break. We're going to continue here, but so we say preparing, teaching for God's glory. I mean, ultimately, everything that happens in my life, in your life, can definitely fall within the vein of God's glory. But, I also think, and I'll just theorize this. I will theorize here that I believe there's also a toughening that they needed to survive the wilderness. They learned how to live with little. They learned how to work hard. They learned how to push their bodies. They learned how to endure. Because certainly, as we find out later on, the Egyptians made the labor even worse, deprived them of necessary tools and resources in order to continue their building project, therefore making it complete torture and making it hard on their backs. They went through a lot. But it taught them how to endure. It taught them how to be tough. It taught them how to survive. And the reality is, if you're living on the fat of the land, as they say, you'd never survive in a wilderness. Those kinds of scenarios in which we're stretched and our faith is stretched and our bodies are stretched to maximum capacity and we have to live under the weight of some adverse circumstances, those things are not learned in plenty. They're learned in lack. It seems cruel. It does. And it probably felt exceedingly cruel to them. We can't minimize what they endured. We can't pretend that those whips on their back they were glorifying God for. Nobody is going to pretend any more than you and I are going to pretend that when we're going through our stuff that it's all roses and sunshine. It's not. When we're going through our stuff, it's heavy. It hurts. It causes anxiety. It causes questioning. It does that to us. It stretches us. But there's no doubt in some regards it does toughen us up enough so that our capacity enlarges. And our ability to withstand at times will grow a bit stronger. I know that for myself. So here we are. They're in suffering. They're in this place of pressure. And as we touched on, the Hebrew midwives are ordered to kill every single male. They fear God, so they don't obey the command, but the Pharaoh commands the Egyptians to report the birth of all the male Hebrew children, so that he could then take those infants and drown them in the Nile River. So we get to Exodus chapter 2. We're going to read a portion of Scripture, starting from verses 1 to 10. Does anybody want to read? Exodus 2, verses 1 to 10. Exodus 2, 1 to 10. Anybody? Or shall I? Okay, I shall. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sisters stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sisters said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." I find this story fascinating. And if you really think about it, these circumstances are wild. It is wild that this child, absent of the intervention of God, I don't know about you, it would have to be an incredible desperation move for me to even try to form some sort of small boat to place my baby of 3 months in and lay him on the water and hope to God that he floats somewhere worthwhile. That's huge. I must say that I tip the proverbial hat already to Moses' mother, because that was an incredible leap of faith. It's interesting to me to see that imagery of the one who would deliver the children of Israel from Egypt, floating over the very vehicle that Egypt was using to kill children. He floats down this river and he lands into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, really, what are the chances of that happening? Except that the finger of God itself was guiding that ark precisely where it needed to be. And I will also say that Miriam was quick on her feet for a kid. I mean, really, think about what Miriam did to immediately take that opportunity, and quite a chance. Because if I were operating with all cylinders, I, being the Pharaoh's daughter, would look at this convenient ark with a Hebrew baby inside of it, landing at my feet, and all of a sudden a little Hebrew girl is coming out of the bushes to say, hey, want me to get a nurse for the baby? I think I would put two and two together in my mind and know that that child is connected to this infant and that this was all staged. But she went forward with it, and not only did she go forward with it, but essentially gave the mother of this infant a wage to raise her own son. It is fortunate that his mother was involved in his raising, because she had the unique opportunity in weaning him to also be able to instill the Jewish values, the promised children's values, into him up until that point. She would be able to tell him the stories of the forefathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She'd be able to sing whatever songs they had. You know, it's oral tradition at this point because nothing's really written down. And so she would be passing the stories of the ways in which God operated and how he created the world, how the fall happened. She would be one who would be able to tell him that Messiah is coming at some point. There's going to be a seed that crushes the head of the serpent. God's going to somehow rectify everything that happens. And Moses would never know that he is actually an incredibly essential part of that plan. If he doesn't save the children of Israel through his obedience to God and get them out of Egypt and back to the promised land, nothing after that point happens. Calvary does not happen without Moses. Calvary is impossible without Moses. You have got to get the children of Israel back in their location and that lineage carrying forward without a Pharaoh that is aiming to try and destroy them completely. This is unbelievable if you really think about it. He's hearing stories and doesn't realize that he's going to be a very crucial part of making it happen. If you look through Scripture, you can count out some people. As a matter of fact, I'll take from all of you some examples. There are not many individuals in the Bible whose story from birth to death is told. Not many. You get little snapshots of people, little snippets of their lives. But somebody whose life is told from beginning to end. What's an example in the Bible of someone whose life is told from beginning to end? Jesus. There we go. Okay. You know, the Messiah of the world. A pretty important character, right? And so, yeah, it makes sense that we would know everything that happens in his life from birth to death. Jacob, there's another person we find out from birth to death, the entire evolution of his character and who he is. Another critical person in this story. Who else can you think of that we find out from birth to death? Maybe don't think of an outright hero. John, okay, absolutely. We find out about John the Baptist from start to finish. Yeah, from Elizabeth and the babe leaping in the womb, all the way to foo on the platter. You know, like we get the whole thing, we do. Who's an example of someone that we find from birth to death and maybe has a little bit of a harder story to stomach? I'll give you a clue. He was a judge of Israel. Born with sight, died without sight. Samuel. Oh, well, yeah, we get Samuel from yes, we do. Samson is who I was thinking of. Samson. We hear his story, but think about it. There aren't that many. We can rifle them off pretty quick because we don't have a huge pool to choose from. When the Bible stops and devotes this much time, and really these many books, to one person's lifetime, and they were the author of them, and they comprise really the foundation stone of the law and of Jewish understanding of God. This is a significant person, and it's worth pausing to hear more of their story. And so, he's drawn out of it. He has the benefit of the education from his mother as to who the promised people are and who God is. But he also has the benefit of being savvy in the ways of the Egyptians and being a son of Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh's grandson. Let's shorten it that way. Adopted grandson. To be a part of Pharaoh's family means that he was able to get a completely different education as well, from the finest of the fine, and all the riches at his disposal and everything he could possibly want for. But he's not blind. And we find out in the story of Moses that right away he sees the oppression of what is truly his people. And it bothers him. And he takes some matters into his own hands, and you can read about it in Scripture, where he saw a taskmaster beating a Hebrew, and he killed him, buried him in the sand. Let's read Hebrews 11. If somebody can pull verses 24 to 26. Hebrews 11, 24 to 26. Anybody who finds it can read that. Wow. I have to tell you, that's a powerful portion of Scripture, because the truth is, Moses could have had at his disposal absolutely anything he wanted. Pharaoh in Egypt, and we mentioned this last week, but I'll repeat it one more time to really lock it in our heads. According to the Egyptians, Pharaoh was God. He was a deity. He could call the shots. He was part of divine order for the Egyptians. When he spoke, it was without question that whatever he needed, whatever he requested, whatever he wanted, they would bow and scrape to make that happen, because they treated him as a god on earth, manifested to govern the people. Moses would have had all those trappings. And it says here in Hebrews, the Hall of Fame chapter, as we sometimes call it, that he refused to be called her son. He chose affliction with the people of God instead of enjoying the pleasures of sin that he knew would be temporary. I often think in my life, and I ask myself this question, especially if I ever feel like I'm going off of the rails. I have to ask myself the question of, are you sacrificing things that are eternal right now for that which is temporary? Is this fix you're getting right now, whatever it is that's satisfying your wants, your desires, your illusions, whatever it is, we all know ourselves, right? It doesn't have to be a grandiose thing. It could be something relatively small. But is this thing that I'm doing here and now an unfair trade for myself? My laying down what feels uncomfortable at the time, because believe me, being in any way associated with the Hebrews when they are slaves under the Egyptian thumb is not exactly pleasurable. There's nothing great about that. And I will tell you that sometimes in my walk with God, I don't know about you, but I've gone through seasons that were less than happy. And if I could have skirted around them and avoided them, sure, like any other rational person, I might be tempted to do that. And then I remember, or at least I try to remind myself, that whatever it is that seems to be convenient in this moment is truly temporary and is never going to replace whatever it was I was set to learn had I actually stuck with it. I put this in another class this way. I sometimes wonder in my life if I had made sure to align myself with whatever message God was speaking that day and not check out mentally. If I had made sure to devote myself to prayer on a particular day more than I did, to have pushed myself a little further, where could I be and what could I have done? I will never know what I could have been or could have done if I had said yes to God more than I said yes to myself. I'll never know. But this much I can say, I want to be more like a Moses. I want to be a person who says, you know what, I'm going to align myself with the people of God, and I'm going to cut out some of these other things that seem to be convenient and pleasurable and great to my flesh. Because the reality is, it's temporary, it's temporary, it's temporary. And when the shine, when the luster is gone, I'm left with myself and my own conscience and my own path and my own purpose, and I have to answer for that. Moses chose early on in his life what his answer would be. So, he does what he does. The Egyptian taskmaster is hidden in a shallow grave. And the next day, he's trying to settle a Hebrew dispute. And he's asked a question: do you intend to kill me as you did the Egyptian? His secret is exposed. And in exposing that secret, Moses makes a decision to escape for his life, because he recognizes that what he has done is a slam in the face of the Pharaoh and his, if you will, Egyptian heritage, albeit adopted but still real. And so he flees to Midian, and he spends 40 years there. It's interesting when we look at the scripture and see how people's lives progress. I think right now, the world and this generation is accustomed to things being super quick. Everything's fast. I mean, instant gratification. I don't know the answer to something, pick up my phone, Google, I now know the answer. I need to reach somebody, pick up the phone, I can send them a text message or I can call them, instant answer. I remember when I was a kid, my father, when I would go to high school, my dad would give me a handful of quarters and have me put the quarters in my pocket so that when I got to school, I could go to the payphone on the corner and let him know that I had gotten there safely. Anybody remember the day of payphones? Okay, and quarters, and having enough quarters in order to ring somebody, and because you're ringing a home phone, if they're not there, you don't get them. There was no instant gratification on so much that we take it for granted and actually take advantage of in these days. Because we're in such a quick society, I think sometimes we don't appreciate the slow burn that developing a ministry actually can and at times should be. When we first moved to Massachusetts, back for me for the first time, our pastor, who you've all met, Brother Sterneman, he said to us, I want you guys to settle here for a while before you go off pastoring. I want you to work with us, learn a few things, get some things under your belt. Oh man, we were so impatient. I didn't want to do it. I was like, I'll do it for a little while, but then we got to get out there and, because the will of God is right now. The will of God is right now. Like we have the calling, so if you have the calling, it's now, right? And the reality is calling and timing both are significant to the will of God and do not always align. Think of David. David was called to be king. David was called and anointed to be king. He did not occupy the seat until he dodged a bunch of spears from the real king in place. Sometimes the process is what makes us, so that when we actually launch out and do the thing that God has called us to do, we do it from a position of strength. Moses took 40 years, spent them in the Sinai desert, and he spent it as a shepherd. A lowly position. You all know this, but I got to tell you something. You cannot have a conversation with sheep. It's just not the same as talking to humans. And you can't rationalize things. You can't have deep theological discussions. So when a pastor says the sheep, it's a little different than a shepherd saying the sheep. Okay, and here he is. He's dealing with these little lambs, and there they are. And he has got to keep them grouped together and out of danger when he can't have logical conversation to explain to them the great benefits of not going off a cliff into a wolf's mouth, down the brambles and into the thorns. He can't have that conversation with them. God gives him 40 years. 40 years. We skip over that because in the scriptures, it goes super quick. It's like, and he spent this much time, and then this happened. And so we just blank on all that time. What must that be like to take a Pharaoh's grandson, strip off the robes, the finery, and the good food, and sit him out in the midst of a bunch of stinking sheep until he smells like one himself, in no doubt inferior robes under burning heat? There we go. We started off saying, had the Israelites not gone through their slavery, they wouldn't have had the endurance to necessarily walk through that desert and deal with the wilderness. And so too Moses, unless he had heard the bleating of sheep all day long, could not have dealt with all of the horrendous whining of the people later. And he had to toughen up that skin and those feet. And he had to think creatively how to supply. Those 40 years are what made Moses a deliverer. So, let's go to Exodus 3. Exodus 3. And here we go. This is cool. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I'll now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. What does that next sentence say? Verse 8. Can anybody call that out? Verse 8. The first 4 to 6 words. Perfect. That's what we needed to hear. Who's coming down? God is coming down. Let me just take a commercial break for a moment. I have pored over this section of Scripture, as no doubt you have as well. And we all know that Moses has a lot of questions after this point. Questions of identity, questions of authority, questions of his own skill set. He talks about his inability to speak. He talks about the fact that no one's going to want to listen to him. How am I supposed to identify you? Who should I say called me? What do I say to Pharaoh? What do I do? There's 1,000 questions. And the questions that Moses is asking make it seem like all of this rides on Moses. What am I supposed to do? How do I make this happen? What do I do or say? I am not going to be listened to because I have a problem with my speech. That verse 8, tells us everything from this point forward that we ever need to know about the ministry that God is doing in our lives. God says, I have come down to deliver. Not Moses. God is the deliverer. Moses is the instrument he's choosing to operate through. I say this because I think so many times in our humanity, we are fraught. I know because I've experienced it. I have been fraught with issues of esteem, my own self-esteem, confidence in my skills or lack thereof, questions about whether I'm good enough or not. Am I saved enough or not? Do I pray enough or not? Do I read the Bible enough or not? And I think a lot of times we actually cheat ourselves out of the things that God has called us to because we forget that He's the one who's actually doing it. That the only thing He's asking for us is to be in partnership with Him. That all He's looking for is the obedience of us saying, okay, cool, you're about to do this thing and you want me to be a part of it? Absolutely. I'm there. What do you need me to do? It's not even about our capabilities. Moses was a stutterer. Moses was the Pharaoh's grandson who killed an Egyptian taskmaster during his grandfather's project and then fled and didn't talk to nobody for 40 years. Moses was just a Hebrew kid that avoided death and got adopted out of pity. Think about it. What qualifications? If he shows his face back in Egypt, it could be an absolute offense. I mean, think about it. And yet God is saying, I'm the one who enables all of this. I've heard the oppression of my people. I've heard their cries. I understand their pains. And I am going to deliver them. Period, end of story. I say to all of us to encourage us in the fact that if God is even having the conversation with you, it's because His will is already ironclad, and it is based solely at this point on your obedience and nothing else to do with you. If it was to do with you, then flesh would be able to glory. And doesn't the scripture say specifically, no flesh should be able to boast? Because when God does His work to glorify Himself. Not so that you and I get the accolades, but that He can show how strong He is and that He can work through our frail humanity. You know what, Moses? Why shouldn't you be the one to deliver the message? It's perfect. It should come through a stutterer. Because when you begin to speak, that voice is going to command the divine of Egypt. When you speak, the plagues will fall. When you speak, the people of God will be protected. When you speak, Pharaoh will let the people go. Yeah, it should be your voice. It's precisely the voice it should be. And in our weakness, He's made strong. That is really the crux of Moses' calling, and it's the crux of your calling and my calling. Let's fast forward slightly. We're going to be rounding this down rapidly. Verse 13, then Moses says to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is His name? What do I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am that I am. In Hebrew, it's Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. It actually is a pretty powerful statement. When the scripture says, I am that I am, it is an equivalent to saying, I am who I say I am. I identify as what I identify as. I will be what I will be is the basic Hebrew translation. I will be what I will be. So you know what, Moses? You know what, Jennifer? You know what, Alex? You know what, Heidi? You know what, Dad? What do you need God to be? Because He will be what He will be. Does He need to be deliverer? Does He need to be healer? What does He need to be? Because when He identifies Himself to His people, He says, I will be what I will be. He has already said prior, Moses, I'm going to be the deliverer. So don't worry about it. I'm going to do my thing. God doesn't have any of these constraints that you and I do. The entire world came into existence at His voice, at His word. Why shouldn't I be able to come into the fruition of my own ministry in His eyes at His word? He's that good. So he tells Moses a few things. He gives him a few signs, if you will. Because when Moses' self-inadequacy persists, God basically furnishes him with, if you will, this almost symbolic show of power. He says, I'm going to show you that you can actually work miracles just by commanding these things, because this is easy for me. This is nothing for me. I can speak things into existence. I can speak them out of existence. None of this is difficult for me. So he tells Moses, take that ordinary shepherd's staff, that thing you've been using this entire time. You've been commanding sheep with this thing. I want you to take it. I want you to throw it down on the ground. Does anybody remember what happens when it's thrown on the ground? It does. And then, in terror, he's looking at this, and what does God tell him to do then? Pick it up. How many of you grabbing the tail of a snake these days? Not me. Okay. Definitely not me. God says, pick it right back up. What happens? I'll be what I'll be. I'll do what I do. I am what I am. Let my people know. I got this. This is nothing. This is nothing. If I have to turn the lights out and they're all in darkness, if I have to kill the firstborn, if I have to make gnats and boils, I will get my work done because I am what I am. I'm deliverer by any means. I think it's amazing. This story is amazing. And Moses, the fact that God was so merciful, I think it's cool how in the end, Moses still feeling so unsure of himself after he sees the staff, after the second sign, the leprous hand. Take a look at your hand. His hand is leprous. Put it in your cloak. Look at it again. Nothing. He's still not getting it. He's still upset about the way he sounds. It's like, I know you have all that power, but your power is great about all these things outside of me. But there's a problem in me that's always been present, that's always felt insurmountable, that I can't get past. The problem is not in all of these things that you've made me do outside of myself. The problem's me. Anybody in here ever feel that way? Like God is talking to you and saying, I got things for you to do, and you're like, but I'm the problem. Like I get what you can do outside of me, but I'm the actual issue. I'm the problem. Moses. Oh, if you had only known. God is so patient. And he says, fine. God actually got pretty miffed. And he says, you know what, fine. You think you're the problem? Got it. Aaron will speak for you. If you can't talk, Aaron will speak for you. Anybody tell me where they ever saw Aaron speak for Moses? He got appointed his little speaker. Aaron will say all the things. And then you fast forward in the story and you don't see Aaron have to do any of the speaking. God is gracious in that he says, okay, yeah, gotcha. I need you to get out there and do it, so sure, I'm going to give you the support system. And, you can, yeah, you're all set. And then when we get there, the boldness of God, the mercy of God that proves to us over and over, you were the one I wanted to talk through the entire time. I just needed you to get on board with it. I'm gonna wind this down, and we'll pick up the rest of it next week because there's a lot to unpack in the story of Moses. But I do want to say that I think the thing that we're really going to uncover as we move forward is how human Moses is, how prone to frustration he is, and how often, even in his ministry, despite what he saw God do that was mighty and incredible, he still had the propensity to sort of take it back in his own hands and do his own thing. And I will say, Moses definitely had an anger issue. He sees somebody getting whipped. I know how to handle this. I shall kill him and bury him in sand. He gets upset. I don't know. I got to be honest. I don't know if I could ever get so mad that if I saw the finger of God actually write on stone that I'd take it and slam it to the ground and break it in a million pieces. Like, you can't even get me to put my Bible, my paper Bible, on the floor without me feeling intense guilt and like scooping it back up. So I don't know that you could ever get me to like destroy tablets. The dude had an anger issue, okay? Like he just did. And how about the time where God's like, speak to the rock and water will come forth, and he takes his staff and he's like beating the rock. Like he was at times a very frustrated and angry dude. I think Jethro, his father-in-law, was aware of that and said, "You're wearing yourself out with people." Maybe Moses just would get overwhelmed every so often. He's a very human character. And there's a grace that was on his life that was also measured with divine justice too. And as we unpack his story in the next couple weeks, I really hope that we're able to take some lessons for ourselves, that even in our humanity, even in our mess-ups, even in our basing ministry on our own capability, there is a goodness in God that sees past what we see in ourselves and is able to not see a stuttering, angry guy who's hiding out because of being afraid of the repercussions of what he's done in his life. He sees somebody who can be an instrument in deliverance and actually set the stage for Messiah. So much so, that when that Messiah comes, and I've always thought this was a beautiful moment in Scripture, that when that Messiah comes to earth, long after God has buried Moses himself on the mountain, that somewhere on a hill, standing with Jesus, there's an image of Moses having a conversation with the Messiah he helped pave the way for. It's incredible when you really think about it. So, we will stop there. Any thoughts or questions? Everybody good? You forgot. If you remember it, write it down for next week. Maybe I'll have an answer. Say that one more time. The Pharaoh who was Hotempec, if I remember the name. Bear with me 1 second. Related to the one that was the father of the daughter who drew him out? No. There was a changeover in that time, not the same one. I can look historically and tell you next week the precise names of the lineage, if you just give me that time. I had it jotted on not last week's, but the week's before's notes. So I have that at home. Oh, that's so stupid. How come I can't remember it? Yeah, I'll get that for you. Maybe I can actually access it here, because I have my notes saved. So there's debate. Some say, that's it. It was Hatshepsut. I knew it was something, so I'm like, no, Hatshepsut. And then he died, Thutmose came in, and then there's debate if it might have been Ramses II that he goes back to. Yeah. So it was probably the Ramses lineage by the time he goes back. Because, of course, at that point, it's 40 years. His grandfather would have been gone at that point, and a new one would have occupied. Scholars debate that one. That's the one that's a little funny. They believe it was Ramses II. That's what they believe. Yeah. All right. Anything else to stretch my will and fortitude for history? All right. Well, who would like to close us in prayer?